When people think of retro consoles, they tend to never really think about the PS2, which is widely considered to be the greatest video game console of all time, selling well over 160 million units worldwide. I've been playing my PS2 non-stop for the last year or so, and it's hands down the best thing that I've picked up, and it's made me love gaming even more than I already did. And out of all of the consoles that I've played, the Wii, 360, PS3, PS4, the PS2 is just different, and this doesn't even have anything to do with the backwards compatibility allowing you to play any PS1 game you want, but more so the PS2 and the games themselves that are regarded as the best in gaming history. With how prevalent the topic of old games are better than new games naturally creates that looming question of, is all of this just nostalgia driven? But over time of maturing, not really, I've realized that it's not just nostalgia bait because so many people my age, including me, love these games so much. But I've always wondered, out of all of the retro consoles out there, why is it that the PS2 is always the one that gets compared to modern games today? Or I guess I should say, is the PS2 even really considered retro?
I'm here for the PlayStation 2. The best entertainment system to hit the world.
You know, when I made my Why Do Young People Love Old Games video, I had grouped the PS2 in the retro console category, and so many people in my comments were like, huh? Retro? I thought retro meant NES, Super Nintendo, N64, basically every Nintendo console. Well, by definition, the PS2 is retro because it's over 20 years old. But I think even if it was 30, 40, or 50 years old, the reason why it still feels so modern today and gets compared to new games today is because this was basically the start of the modern era of video games. Or what I like to call it, it's a modern retro console. Because think about it, the PS1 was when we really started seeing game companies pushing for more and more realistic 3D scenes like Silent Hill and Metal Gear Solid 1, but they were still confined to the hardware limitations. But then when the PS2 came out in 2000 with its 32 megabytes of RAM, this is when we essentially saw the culmination of everything game developers did before. Suddenly it was like every single one began pioneering and revolutionizing their own specific genres like Rockstar Games, making not the first open world game, but taking everything past games did and just doing it better. Every time I ask my dad what was it like playing GTA 3 for the first time, he always says that it blew their minds that you could run around in a realistic city, go anywhere you want, when you want without getting held back. I can imagine how crazy it must have been to think, wow, this is really what the future of gaming is going to look like. Or how Metal Gear Solid 2 paved the way for the stealth and story-driven genre, or the Tony Hawk Pro Skater games, influencing an entire generation of skateboarding in real life. I could go on and on about them and we'd be here all day. But if we're being honest, saying that, oh yeah, the games are good, that's what makes the PS2 feel modern in 2025, that's the easy answer. Because if we really want to understand what makes the PS2 feel so timeless, you have to kind of look at it from a different angle. You see, the PS2 released dead smack in the middle during the whole Y2K stuff when everyone thought the world was gonna end. And the late 90s and early 2000s was when we started seeing the whole Y2K aesthetics, which essentially is a retro futuristic kind of style, a little bit different than your typical early 2000s style. And many companies had already started getting in on this kind of style, like the Dreamcast, which in my opinion is one of the coolest looking consoles ever that I really want to get sometime in the future. But Sony wanted to also tap into this, but in a slightly different way. If you just look at the PS2's design, first glance, it has that sleek peak Y2K vibe, with the only visible colors being the PlayStation logo, with the light bluish futuristic font, which all of this together, people consider this to be the best looking PlayStation console ever. And when you turn it on, the very first thing that you hear is to me, it almost has that mysterious, ominous sound that the first time that I heard it, I was like, whoa, okay, now that is different. Because if you want me to be honest, the PS5 startup sound is a little pretty boring, honestly. That was like 3 seconds, and there was like nothing unique about it. Again, this isn't even talking about the individual games that people say are so good, which they are. But besides those, the model, the startup sound, the menus, everything about it is unique and almost unsettling in a way. Because if your PS2 doesn't work at first, which for me happens almost all the time, or if there's a laser problem, then your screen is going to be stuck on these weird glowing towers for a minute until you turn it off and turn it back on, or just sit there and wait and wait. And speaking of unique, there's something about the way PS2 games themselves look. Now, I don't own a CRT TV yet, but I am aware that the way PS2 games look on this 4K TV will look vastly different than a 480p screen. But even still, it feels like all PS2 games have this very distinct aesthetic that you won't find on any other console. They all have that soft, sometimes muted feel with the colors. There is a heavy use of bloom and fog effects that were a very clever way to mask the draw distance due to the limitations. This is why you always hear people say, man, PS2 games felt massive, when they really weren't. It's just an illusion. Take San Andreas for example. This is what the map looks like with all of the PS2 effects, and then this is what it looks like without that. Now, which one would you rather play? And this is actually due to a very specific lighting technique that developers used on the PS2. You see, games now are able to use natural lighting. A developer can just drop light into Unity or Unreal, and the light will be able to bounce off of different things without them having to do anything. On the PS2, however, that didn't exist, so they had to get creative by faking all of it. For example, I always wondered, why do the sunsets look so freaking beautiful on the PS2? I tend to always just sit and stare at them for minutes on end. Well, that's because it's all controlled by vertex and color filters. They can set the tone to whatever color they want, they can brighten the textures, which is why everything looks so much more exaggerated than now. It's all handmade. Like, anything handmade is always gonna have so much more style. Maybe it's just the games that I play, but there's never been any other game on any console that has even come close to this kind of aesthetic, which leads me into my next point. It's kind of crazy to think that not only is the PS2 25 years old, but it was also technically the weakest console during the 6th generation of games, because it for sure damn doesn't feel that way. A lot of these games are almost on par with games today, and this is because due to the limitations of the PS2, it had forced developers to get creative, use different tricks and workarounds, and just use every single inch they could on it. But there's also one other very specific thing that the PS2 had over everyone else at the time, and that is the Emotion Engine CPU. Prior to the PS2's release, Sony had been hyping this up like crazy, because what it did was it allowed for more characters and objects to be in one single scene, smoother animations, way better looking graphics than the PS1's polygon textures, and overall better atmospheric details, hence why people always say the leap from PS1 graphics to the PS2's is crazy. And as years went on and as developers began getting more familiar with it, that's when we started seeing the graphics getting better and better and better, because by the time we got to the end of the PS2's lifespan, they damn near started looking like next-gen graphics. And still to this day, millions of people prefer the PS2 style that was undoubtedly ahead of its time. And when I started looking at it from that angle, and not just these games are super old, that's why they're retro, that's when I began understanding why people, especially older than me, feel like the PS2 isn't really retro compared to other consoles, even though it technically is.